think that's a wolf or a coyote, I'm not sure though. I wonder what he keeps turning around to look at. This is Will Buchanan reporting for the Walk for Liberty. It's June 8th, 2008, day 56 of the Walk for Liberty. In contrast to the windmills from yesterday, one from yesteryear. I think those steep mountainous hills yesterday did a number on me. Last night, my left thigh was sore after the walk, probably from going up all those steep hills yesterday. Fortunately, today it feels better. Unfortunately, today my left shin is bothering me, which I'm guessing is due to going down all the hills. I was speaking yesterday with the husband portion of the man and wife team that runs the RV park we stayed at last night. We talked about all the windmills that are in this area. He said that although he likes the idea of the windmills for the energy independence aspect, that he personally has mixed feelings about them, due to the red blinking lights that the FAA requires on them at night, because the dozens of blinking lights disrupts the viewing of the nighttime sky. We then spoke a bit more about energy, and he said he'd like a president who, like John F. Kennedy, would declare, and I'm paraphrasing, "We will become energy independent by the end of the next decade." And although I admire his sentiment, the government shouldn't be mandating or even encouraging any specific type of energy policy. Just as John F. Kennedy's call to put a man on the moon came with millions or billions of dollars in contracts to companies to accomplish that, most likely a similar call by a current president would also involve billions of extra dollars of government spending. But the answer to the energy problems is not more government involvement, it's less. Government involvement in any industry, be it energy or aviation or farming, messes up the market signals and leads to a much less efficient way of doing things than would be chosen naturally by people and companies interacting voluntarily in the free market. Let's take gas and other petroleum products as an example. Government is doing things on both sides to interfere with the market signals. For example, there are many acres of potential oil fields in Alaska which the federal government is prohibiting drilling in. I don't know if they own that land, but if they don't, they might as well, because they're telling the owners what they can or can't do with it. If companies were allowed to drill that land for oil, it could open up vast new reserves and could also potentially lower the price of oil and gas. In addition, from my understanding, there have been no new oil refineries built in America in over 30 years because of the amount of regulation and red tape involved. Oil companies have had to make do with patching up aging refineries rather than replacing them, which could also be artificially keeping the price of oil higher than it would be otherwise. What kind of special waitress do they want? On the other side of the equation, though, is a huge factor which is potentially keeping oil prices far lower than they would otherwise be in a free market. And that's the U.S. military. For the past several decades, the U.S. government's military has effectively served as security for American oil firms, particularly in the Middle East. If American companies had to provide their own protection for their own oil wells in foreign lands, then the price of gas would be far higher. I'm guessing that many people, even if they realize this, would be in favor of this policy because they want cheap gas. But what people want is not actually cheap gas. What they really want is just a cheap way to get from point A to point B. And that's where the free market and alternative energy sources come into play. Because the U.S. government's military involvement in the Middle East has artificially kept gas prices low, the free market has been stunted from developing cheap alternative energy sources. Let's say the U.S. military wasn't in the Middle East providing security for oil companies. And because of that, gas prices were far higher, say $8 or $9 a gallon. Companies would then have far more of a profit motive to develop alternative energy sources to compete with gasoline. And effectively, companies and consumers would together decide what is the cheapest, most efficient form of energy to use as a fuel source. And that may or may not be oil and gasoline. Another way the federal government interferes with the energy market is by decreeing which alternative energy source they think is the best. Essentially, they pick one alternative energy source, most likely due to political reasons, and then subsidize the development of it. That energy source, though, is not necessarily the best one to use. The current Bush administration has favored both ethanol and fuel cells. Companies and individuals operating voluntarily in the free market, however, are much more effective in figuring out what is the best energy source to use. If a company, which is voluntarily funded through its shareholders, decides to invest in alternative energy source A, and that energy source turns out to be too expensive, then that company might fail. However, only its shareholders, who voluntarily invested, will lose out. If the U.S. government picks the wrong alternative energy source to subsidize, then all taxpayers lose out. However, a company operating in the free market has a very strong incentive to develop a cheap, reliable energy source. Because if it does succeed in developing a good alternative energy source, it will profit tremendously, and both it and consumers will win. We have 30 more miles to Idaho. Between the two different walks I did today, I walked exactly 10 miles, and Brooke went 3.5 on the second walk. This is Will Buchanan for blog.walkforliberty.com, signing off.